Shabbat Shalom, my friends. For those of you observing the 8th day of Passover, Chag Sameach as well, we all know that observing a 2nd day of the Chag and an 8th day of the Chag comes not from the Torah, but from the post-biblical period. There was a concern back then that as the Jewish people spread all across the world, not everyone would get the official word in a timely fashion as to precisely when the festival would begin. So a Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot was established, a second festival day for the diaspora. If you didn't hit it the first day, hit it the second day, it would all work out well. One of the serious changes in the Jewish ritual calendar made by the Reform movement was to declare that in our times it was in fact possible to know precisely when the Chag, the festival, begins. And so these extra days, the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot, no longer necessary. Passover thus became, for most Reformed Jews, a 7-day observance. So the current situation, a little bit complicated, is like this. Most Jews of all streams who live in Israel observe the length of a festival based upon the Torah requirements. What does that mean? 7 days. Most Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews who live outside of Israel, and some Reform Jews as well, observe the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot and thus have an 8-day Passover. Most Reform Jews observe 7 days. Interestingly, some Orthodox and conservative Jews who move from the diaspora to Israel will choose to observe the 8th day even while they live in Israel, because there is a strong preference in Jewish tradition to maintain previous customs. So there are some Jews in Israel who observe the 8th day of the diaspora. And just to make things even more interesting, the Sephardic community from the Middle East and from North Africa observe a totally separate festival on what would be the 8th day of Passover. Do you know what the name of that festival is? Correct, Maimuna. Maimuna. It is not a religious event, but it is a huge celebration marked by fabulous food, thus very successful. What does Maimuna mean? We don't exactly know. We have many guesses. We don't know. It's a time for prayers for good luck, prayers for success, and along the way, prayers for finding a suitable marriage partner. When did Maimuna start? We don't exactly know. But Maimuna is widely observed in Israel by Sephardim and by Ashkenazim as well. And did I mention the foods are totally magnificent? Now, what does all of this have to do with our study of the Torah this week? A lot. Orthodox and conservative Jews in the diaspora will be reading this Shabbat morning a section from Deuteronomy special for the 8th day of Chag, 8th day of the festival of Passover. That section, by the way, focuses on the establishment of a Jewish ritual calendar, including Passover, and thus it fits, and it's a good fit for this particular day. But for Reform Jews who will consider this Shabbat not as Chag, there is no reason to read that passage from Deuteronomy. So instead, we read the passage that we skipped last week. We read Shmini from the book of Leviticus. So I'm going to ask your forbearance. For this week, we have to set aside that wonderful sense that everywhere in the world, all Jews are reading the same portion from the Torah, no matter where they might live. But not to worry, next week we'll be back in sync again. And for those of you who pay close attention to these Torah conversations, yes, you're right. I changed my mind. Last week I said we would delay our encounter with Shmini until next year. But in a massive display of flexibility, I'd like to share with you now the story that is told in the Sedra known as Shmini, Leviticus 10:1 and following. Shmini means the 8th day. It was the 8th day. Aaron and his sons had gone through a complex process of becoming consecrated for the very first time as priests. That consecration process took 7 days, and now dawn breaks. It is the 8th day. 2 of Aaron's 4 sons, Nadav and Avihu, took up their fire pans, placed incense in them, and offered what the text describes as Eish Zara, an alien fire which had not been enjoined upon them. And the result, fire burst forth from God and consumed both men. They died on the spot on the 8th day. In response, Moses, their uncle, declared in the name of God, Bikrovai ekadesh, I will be sanctified by those who are nearest to me. The bereaved father, Aaron, said nothing. And after the young men are buried, the text simply moves forward, and the rest of our text this week, if you will, deals with issues of kashrut, of ritually appropriate food. What's going on here? Ibn Ezra says that the problem is not that Nadav and Avihu offered a false sacrifice or tried to sneak in an offering to a foreign deity. What they did under ordinary circumstances would have been just fine, but they brought their incense offering on their own, uncommanded, thus out of order. And for that, they died. Sforno agrees. He said they disregarded the newly established rules, and this was a fatal mistake. So we can assume that they died believing that what they had done was the right thing. Another commentator reflected on that famous story of Elijah, where in order to prove, you know the story, that the God of Israel was superior to Baal, Elijah built an altar, placed a sacrifice upon it, didn't light it, waited, and a divine fire came down, ignited the sacrifice, and proved that Adonai Hu Elohim, God is the real God. So Nadav and Avihu apparently didn't trust that such a divine fire would come on its own. So they initiated the fire. They started it by themselves. Their faith was weak, and for that they died. Rashi now chimes in with the thought that perhaps they were drunk. After all, shortly after the story of their deaths, right next to that passage in the Torah, Aaron is commanded never to appear drunk before God. Aha, said Rashi, this proves that Nadav and Avihu were drunk, and thus they did what they did. When I read this text, I find profound meaning in Moses' quote of what he said God had uttered. Bikrovai ekadesh, I will be sanctified by those nearest to me. Those who consider themselves to be in the closest of relationships with God are in the most danger. Think about that. First of all, it's far too easy to confuse your desires, your inclinations with the desires and inclinations of the God with whom you feel yourself to be so very closely identified. You feel God's presence so very near. Perhaps you encounter God through mystical experiences, or perhaps your prayer regimen is such that it seems at times that you have clarity as to exactly what it is that God wants of you. The possibility of confusing our thoughts with God's will has in the past led to some truly horrible outcomes. The point, Moses said, Bikrovai Kadesh, it can be very dangerous to be too close to God. Another perspective. It is dangerous to consider oneself or one's tribe or one's people uniquely singled out by God for a mission, for a divine purpose. We can too easily confuse chosen for a mission with better than everybody else. The burden of feeling chosen can be transformative. It can also be overwhelming. It can mislead us to interpret just who we are, to misinterpret just who we are. It can become an excuse, permitting us to demean others, to be inconsiderate of others, to lack empathy for others. We Jews speak of ourselves as a chosen people, chosen for a mission. Perhaps that is so. But if we take such a calling upon ourselves, we must not confuse our sacred task with the license to embrace a sense of superiority. The prophet Amos warned us that the Jewish people have been uniquely called for a sacred mission, chosenness, uniquely called for a sacred mission, and therefore we will be judged more harshly than any other nation. Bikrovai ekadesh. God demands that those who are the closest to the divine must never forget that they are also the closest to divine judgment. That, my friends, is a very sobering thought. Well, that's it for today. Went fast. Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Chag Sameach to many. And a wonderful Maimunah to everybody. And please, hit share. Help others to find their way into our conversation. Have a great Shabbat, great Yom Tov. See you next week.